Hello, welcome back to Bricked, the final part. I did it. I read, I finished the book. There's more stuff to talk about this time around, um, though similar problems show up as the previous ones. But luckily for us, there are more interesting journal entries because of personal problems in his life, which develop. So we're going to get through those, and I'm going to get through my final thoughts. So he opens up this bit by talking about his moving situation. This is going to become a bigger thread that comes up. At least it means a lot to him, clearly. And he acts like he's been talking about this nonstop throughout the book, which, I don't know, it doesn't feel like it. I mean, I'm reading this in bits, right? But from what I remember, I don't remember him talking about his moving a lot. So the way he frames it as if, like, him revealing to the audience that he's actually been trying to move out the entire time and that this ticking clock thing isn't real because he wasn't even slacking on it is not a reveal. It's not really a twist. I don't know what it's like. It's an expectation that no one was having. So, um, that's an odd one to it. Oh, and while he's talking about this, he's talking about moving. He talks about he wants to find a place that is nice. He wants to find a nice place that isn't sketchy, and he frames it as basically people living in pseudo squalor for the experience is something that you do in your 20s moving to New York, not when you're 30 moving to somewhere else in Massachusetts. As if, like, because clearly this he has these ideas about what what about how maturity should look like based off money. Like, if you have a mature person, you have the money to build in a nice house. If you're 30 and you're a poor squalor, that means you failed at this maturity. I mean, that's the implication. And that's weird when you say out loud, like, right? And that's just a strange sentiment. And it highlights his interesting relationship to class, which is a thing that he's been criticized for throughout his time online, and it shows. Um, Also, we now know he's a New England person, which I think if you follow him, it's not really a revelation. That's not so surprising, but I thought I would note it. I'm skipping over some bits because I kind of want to make this more timely, and I think I can because there's a bunch of stuff I wrote that's mostly interesting for me and no one else. So a lot of this is going to be just the journal entries. So the second time he does an entry, the next entry is they go to his sister's college graduation party, like family celebration, like a separate celebration than the one they had in the past. And they have a dinner. He liked it. They leave. They don't know. They realize they don't really have a thing to do this afternoon. And he goes, "Let's play a beat 'em up game," which he then explains in detail what a beat 'em up is in the journal entry to us for, for no reason. Also, his brother's girlfriend is there, but she's only mentioned. She's mentioned, but it's unclear if she actually takes part in this gaming session. So the stuff talks about him and his brother's experience of gaming, but whether or not she's involved in this is unclear to me. Maybe. I don't know. It's noteworthy to me because it leads to this question: did he just like steal the brother off just to do some stuff for himself or not? Which maybe you could read something into that. Maybe not. I don't know. It's a bit ambiguous, but I thought it was, to me, an interesting enough detail to note. So I'm going to avoid too much speculation further. At this point, I made an observation after this entry about how he praises the game. which I've kind of gotten to this already. He has a trouble of actually praising and describing things well enough for it to feel impactful, and he'll do it in these bizarre ways. Like in this section, he praises the game for giving you breathing room to make decisions about how you want to play through the game, which compared to like the Mario series as a whole, that's not new or unusual. That's or rather not new. It's not unique specifically. It's not unique to Super Mario Brothers 3. So him saying that this is what makes it special, it feels hollow because while it's not, a bunch of these other games have it. What separates it apart from those? And he fails to really address that. He's just not good at really digging deeper. He's afraid to in this bit. He's afraid to actually dig deep. I made a point about the apartment thread. I'm going to skip that. We'll come back to that, I think, towards the end, because the apartment thread just keeps going. Because at the time, I did not realize how much this thread was going to keep popping up. So I wrote a comment about, basically, he's playing against Ludwig, the boss, in Pipe Maze. And he wants to comment on his construction and appraise it, but oh, he's in the middle of the fight, so he doesn't have time. But it's like, okay, do it. That's what this book was supposed to be about. Why aren't you doing it? This is a funny. It's not actually that funny. It's not a funny joke at all. But it's an attempt at humor that falls flat, in part because it's like this is the whole point. Why are you making excuses for yourself? It's weird. Makes a comment. Oh, basically at the end of Pipe Maze, Princess Peach gets kidnapped. He points out that she doesn't actually get that kidnapped that often in the early games. This is like one of the second times this happened. And it becoming a cliche is a thing he attributes to Mario as popularizing this, which I think is plausible, but I don't trust him entirely. It just feels very citation needed. You just have to trust him on this. And given how, I don't know, how he is I think, exaggerating the power of Mario to an extent, I am not inclined to jump to that interpretation. So, but he does claim that. And that's it for Pipe Maze. A little more stuff because of journal entries, but still pretty short. Darkland is where stuff gets more interesting, mainly because she gets a bit morbid. His grandmother's health declines, and you can imagine where this might lead. So we start with it declining. They talk about that. He makes a quick point to mention that he's frustrated by watching her suffer and become more and more dependent when she's a very self-reliant person, and watching her struggle makes him and the family feel frustrated and sad, and he's kind of happy to see her move on. I put that in quotes. I couldn't relate to that with my own personal life, so I understand exactly where he's coming from in this. The one thing of note here is that he talks about he's worried about the family, right? He's worried about how his family's going to react when she finally passes. And he describes himself as he feels a bit guilty for moving out when the family needs to stay together in his mind, because that's a projection, mind you. Like he's making that assumption. And it's like, why? Like moving out, that's a step that you need, that's a healthy step. That's not you pulling away necessarily. I don't know. It just feels a bit, the framing of that is weird. It also feels weird to make yourself the villain in this when, like, this is not about you. It's not about, this moving thing is completely independent of this. Like, what are you doing? So that's just weird to me. I don't know what to think of that. Um, he oh, they get to Bowser. He says that Bowser is actually kind of scary in this game. He's actually kind of foreboding. He's militarized his army. His army is, he compares it to Sauron's army because it's using, you know, wood and trees to make all of the tanks and stuff. And it has actual tanks and a navy and an air force. So he's actually threatening by Golden Age video game standards. His paraphrasing here, which that's not ridiculous. I think the framing, I think out of context, him saying, comparing Bowser's army to Sauron's army, I think feels a bit like hyperbole. But you kind of get it in context. Like it makes sense. It's just a bit, feels a little ham-fisted. I don't know. It's not a terrible comparison. I take that back. It's not a terrible comparison, um, to be fair. But yeah, just thought it was an interesting comparison. I wish he had more actual analysis, even close to that, which he does not, more often than not. Oh, and then this is the big sad one. His grandmother dies, unfortunately. And he reasserts that he had a happy childhood. I know I made it sound like my childhood was bad, but actually it was good. And a lot of my happy memories were not about gaming and with my grandmother, which, okay, I believe one of those two things, the grandmother happy memories part, not the former, given that by your own description, your social life sounded terrible. So I'm not inclined to entirely agree with that, but, you know, he still feels the need to do that. After this description of her death, the next journal entry is talking about funeral preparations, and he says he doesn't like funerals in the traditional Western sense of like a service and a procession and all that. They make him uncomfortable. They give him a lot of anxiety. He knows that other people find him comforting, but he doesn't find him comforting, and so, and he also admits that he admits that he's not bad at actually dealing with emotional help, and his way of getting through things is just to let time pass, or rather to just power through it. I can kind of relate to bits of that too in processing grief. I can relate to this entire bit, frankly. So I understand entirely where he's coming from here in this entire section. But the thing that interests me, and I made a note here, is that the way he frames this, like he keeps feeling this need to like come back and reassert an intellectual reasoning. When I feel like he like tries to reassert emotional control over everything, even when he clearly doesn't have it. Like he hates and fears that loss of control. Maybe that's too speculative, but that's what it feels like. And yeah, that's, I think, really all my thoughts on that for the moment. This is a funny one. He's fighting doing a sky level and fighting airplanes, and he's saying when he was a kid he imagined it full of smoke and fire, and Mario's jumping from plane to plane, fighting the enemy, despite all, you know, he's trying to. That's why he did it when he was a kid. Which, when you say it out loud, is both pretty twisted, but also kind of funny. Just to imagine this big, just this random dude in like a fursuit, just like jumping from plane to plane, like a fucking superhero. That's just funny. That's why I wrote. It's just a funny image, and he takes it like it's like he writes that with a completely straight face, like there's no hint of recognition, it being funny, which I think is on brand. Okay, the funeral happens in this journal entry. like he said earlier, the service was beautiful, but he felt uncomfortable. He couldn't handle the wake. He actually left partly for the wake, and he couldn't do the after socializing that happens at funerals, and so he just went home to work on the AC instead. Um, and he says people were socializing at um, the after service, quote, like psychologically healthy human beings, which I that's a bit harsh for yourself, at least for himself. Now, feeling anxious about going to a social event, especially like service and stuff, when they're intentionally meant, depending on the service, obviously, if it's like a Catholic service, it's meant to be this big, overwhelming thing. I certainly don't. I'm not a fan of those kind of services. I liked when my grandfather died, we had like a celebration of life. We had a cremation and a celebration of life, and that felt more comforting to me than the Catholic service, which I think was just more scary, and it felt comforting. So I completely get. I don't know what service he was having, but I completely get where he's coming from vis-a-vis these kind of services. And I don't think he should beat himself up over not being around people. You know, he's grieving. I guess this is his grieving process. He admits that. So he has this self-deprecating streak. Um, but yeah, he's also like, oh, I need to finish the game now before I move because that will make it the most complete because it's all about nostalgia. It's all about reliving my past. And what better way to do that than it being in my childhood home? Um, given his, it highlights this I think I think it's just interesting that he's turned this into a work project. This feels like workaholism. Both, it's pleasure, yes, but it's still a work. Um, I don't know. He calls Bowser a graphical achievement, like the best graphical achievement in the game. I'm not going to really get into that. Um, he likes that the fact that Mario has to be quick-witted to beat Bowser. Mechanically, you have to to think outside the box, which, because like Bowser's supposed to be the big dumb one, and Mario is the quick, nimble, clever one, which I think plays into his own fantasy of being a clever clogs knight defender hero man. Um, and just not, just a theory of mine, I guess, or it's just a thought. And in his conclusion, this is still his favorite game. He thinks it's the best one of the original format. Quote, that's probably it. He says there's no other game that ever made him feel this way. Quote, that's probably every bit a flaw in me as it is in modern gaming. Yes, but what it is, and the epilogue is him saying, getting to his new apartment, grabbing the NES, plugging it in, and being like, it's home now. Which, I feel mean saying this, but I don't know, that's kind of sad. I don't know, like the conclusion, by the way, like stepping back, this dovetails into, I think, the biggest thing about this book. This book clearly did not have a second draft. I don't even think it has an editor, but besides him. And it shows. Like it starts out saying it's going to be one thing, and then it ends up just being this let's play. And if it's just he just went back and rewrote it and restructured it and actually tailored it to be about something. Like he has these things in his life that he could try to make parallels to within the book. But he doesn't. He just kind of has them there. He lets them sit awkwardly as he whiplashes back and forth between his grandma dying and suddenly we're at the final level and he's trying to push through it. Like he is pushing through everything via his work in the book as he is in real life. and it's terrible. It makes everything worse. It means he doesn't actually sit down and process and structure things and meditate on the way things are. He just sort of pushes through it, and it's just full of it's just poorly structured. It's a book that's poorly structured, poorly written, um, overshares constantly, and yet for what this kind of book is, to the point where the oversharing bits are the thing I end up fixating on the most, not the Mario analysis. Like he'll make these, even like when there are little bits of analysis, I end up skimming over it because it feels so pedestrian. It's like with the praise example where he's praising it for the tiniest of things, and it makes you numb, right? It doesn't make it feel like this has earned the praise that it's being given. It feels damning by fine praise. It makes you doubt this game is as good as he says it is, which is not a good sign. Like I imagine SMB3 is actually a very masterfully made game, and I bet it is. I bet all of those games are. They are very well made games. There's a reason that people like dissecting them, and they are useful to dissect too as entry level exercises into analysis of mechanics and how they create meaning and create an experience. But man, and especially the apartment stuff too. Even by the end, he's having this kind of gross, this interesting thread about him fixating on his apartment as not just as an exciting thing because it's his first time in 30 years that he's lived away from his family, which I think is telling in so many ways about both the time, the fact that it's part of a shift to the lengthening of how long people stay with their parents before moving out. Right? I know movie Bobby is not exactly the most robust statistical sample, but it's this stuff that you could. I think from a time capsule perspective, there's a lot about this book that I think it preserves in amber. But if you really want to do that, you just go through and watch his old stuff. Has that quality to it more than this. Gets you more to the point. This is just bloated. It's just bloated. And it's full of just weird idiosyncrasies, which is, I think, the best parts of the book, but also the parts that I end up looking for the most. But to get there, you have to slog through a bunch of redundant crap. His constant re-explaining of every single thing, even things his audience should know, of terms they should know, of concepts that they are probably all familiar with, not understanding his audience, drifting away from his structural points all over the place, turning his analysis into essentially a diary. Oh man, it's bad. It's bad. The thing is, I think because it overshares so much, I can see why haters of like Movie Bob's worst critics, like we're talking the Kiwi Farms level critics, his worst haters, I think pounce on this book all the time, and they love ripping out quotes from it because it's just easy to use this against him. I think because it overshares in the way it does, because it reveals things that it does not intend to. It's earnest, but yet he's trying to be guarded, and yet it's too earnest in ways that he doesn't seem to acknowledge. It's fascinating, honestly, and it's fascinating in principle. I think if you were to read this, read the intro, read maybe the end. Don't worry about the actual actual second half of the book. It really, a lot of it is just not that important. Just skip to the journal entries. If you're, and that's implying I would recommend this book to you. You don't need to read this book. Um, Generally speaking, I only would recommend it if you're like are really interested in movie Bob and want to understand things about him, because you'll learn things about movie Bob. Things will be put into focus by reading this book. Just be aware that it's also not a good book generally. Not the worst book. Its main crime is just being boring in the second half. Um, that's about it. But yeah, I mean, it's interesting how the tastes of the gaming community have changed in some ways. Like nostalgia right now isn't about, we don't AVGN type people when they do their retro nostalgia. It's not the 80s. It's not 2D games usually. It's 3D platformers. It's survival horror. It's those games. Maybe weird PC games, which he again doesn't really talk about because he doesn't have the same relationship to it. But the tastes aren't with Movie Bob. I don't know if they ever will be again. I think that's what makes him so interesting. He's a bit of an odd duck in the space, for better or worse. And on that note, and I think this book is I think it's fitting. This book is a weird duck in a class of its own. Definitely for worse though, not for better. And yeah, this is the final part. Um, that's all, folks. I hope you have a nice day.